Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing the independent inquiry into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act. My organization, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, is fighting the government over this law in federal court, and we're also participating in that public inquiry. The inquiry is also known as the Rouleau Commission, and it's chaired by an independent, nonpartisan, and respected judge from the Ontario Court of Appeal. It's staffed by nonpartisan and experienced lawyers. The Rouleau Commission is now accepting comments from the public about the protests and the government's response. So that means that you can send in a comment to the inquiry, and your comment may be quoted in the hearings or in the Commission's final report. So it is imperative that the Commission hear from members of the public to understand the full impact of the Federal Emergencies Act on this country's citizens. Today, I'm going to talk to Russell Phillips, the Communications Director from the Canadian Constitution Foundation, about how to send in a comment. We'll give you style suggestions, the background facts you need to know, and some key messages and questions you may want to consider answering. And of course, the technical details of how and when to send in a submission. Russ, thank you so much for joining us today. It's so good to see you in this context. We talk all the time, but not always on the show. So thanks for joining. Let's start by, why don't you tell us who can send in a public comment to the Emergencies Act inquiry? Does it need to be someone who participated in the protests of the Freedom Convoy or someone who was directly observing or affected by it? Who can send it in?
Well, they're looking for public comment from all the public, including people that were directly involved in it, were directly affected by it, or had something they think that the inquiry needs to know.
So who should people address their comment to, and where exactly do they send it if they want to send one in?
So it should be addressed to the Public Order Emergency Commission, and they can send it to an email address or they can send it by mail. The email address is kind of a mouthful, but it's perspectives@poec-cedu.gc.ca, which we have, of course, on the website, on the ccf.ca's main website. You can get that email as well as the mailing address that people can send to if they want to write a letter.
Yeah, these emails are always so terrible. The structure for the emails is so brutal. Now, if someone wants to send in a comment, that's how they address it. That's where they send it. But what's your number one piece of style advice when sending in a comment?
The biggest thing is be civil. Try to come off as reasonable and that thoughtful. The issue has raised a lot of emotions with different people in different ways. But the biggest thing is that in order to be taken seriously, it's important that you come off polite and proper.
Yeah, of course. We want these public comments to matter, and it's so easy to dismiss a letter that's sent in to an independent and nonpartisan inquiry if it's full of partisan language, if it's full of profanity. And look, I get it. I know that people are really angry. I am also angry about the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act because I think it was illegal and it was unconstitutional. That is why we have channeled that anger that we have in our organization into this legal challenge. But how do people channel their anger if they're upset about the use of the Emergencies Act? How do they channel it into a public comment? What would your advice be?
Well, there's nothing wrong with having an explanation of the emotions that you feel, as long as it's done in a calm way. So, like you said, you mentioned partisanship. That don't start off getting angry about Trudeau because this will not be sent to the government, right?
Yeah, this is not going to the government. It's going to an independent, nonpartisan inquiry. It's not being addressed to the Prime Minister. And frankly, this issue is so much bigger than individual politicians. 30 seconds in this segment. Why do these public comments matter? How might they be used by the inquiry?
Well, they matter because people that are involved in this commission are, there's groups that have a standing. There's lawyers and people that are involved in the government, a judge. it's important for the commission to get opinions from all parts of Canadian society, including people that were involved in it or directly affected by it.
Absolutely. When we come back from this commercial break, we're going to talk about some of the content that people can consider including in their comments. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing news that the independent inquiry into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act is now accepting public comments. So that means that any of you who are watching can send in your comment to this inquiry, which might be quoted in the hearings or in the final report. Now, Russ, who's with the Canadian Constitution Foundation, the same organization I work for, Russ, what advice do you have for people about the content of public comments, about the substance of their letter to the inquiry?
Probably the best way to approach it would be what is the most important thing that you want to be sending to the inquiry, and try to keep it concise and clear and focused on that thing. So a 1 to 2 page submission is probably what you want to send in, and maybe address a question or a something specific to your experience.
Yeah, so I think you could send in a description of your experience as an observer or as a participant in the protests, or you could answer some questions. And actually, at the ccf.ca/ emergencies act inquiry, we have a list of those questions that you can answer that can help you frame your main message. Now, Russ, what are some of those questions that people might want to consider answering in their letter to the inquiry?
Sure. So some of the questions that we use as an example would be something like, did the Emergencies Act, did the invocation of the Act make you afraid to attend a protest in the future, including other topics that have no relation to the Freedom Convoy? Did it make you afraid to donate to charities, even charities that have no relation to the Freedom Convoy again? Were you concerned about your financial information being shared with governments if you donated to those groups?
Which, by the way, is a question
Yeah.
we get all the time at the Canadian Constitution
Yes.
Foundation. And just for clarity, making a donation to a registered charity like the Canadian Constitution Foundation could not result in your bank account being seized or frozen. But of course, I understand why this completely over the top reaction from the government has raised that concern among people. It's an unfounded concern, but I do understand why people have it. So it's a great question people can address in their letter to the inquiry. What else could people write about?
For people that might have been involved in protests or observed them, like what did you observe personally? Personal stories. They are important for getting the commission an understanding of that they might not have because they have such distance from it. Another one might be, what did you think that the threshold was passed if you lived in Ottawa, for example? Did you think that using the Emergencies Act was appropriate and that the threshold set by the Act was met? Things like that. Yeah.
The threshold for the act being met is an incredibly important one. That is actually part of the basis of our judicial review, our legal challenge in federal court, is that we are saying that the extremely high threshold of the Emergencies Act was not met, so it was illegal for the government to invoke it. That threshold includes the requirement that no other law can deal with the ongoing situation that's urgent, temporary, and national in scope. And frankly, because these protests were cleared using ordinary police powers, it's pretty evident in our view that that legal threshold wasn't met. One of the other things I think people could write about is this question of transparency. Why hasn't the government provided more information about why the Emergencies Act was invoked? This is part of what we have been in federal court fighting over. We brought a motion to seek access to documents about the explanation that the government has, cabinet level documents that explain why they invoked, the government suggests, explains why they invoked the Emergencies Act, and the government has not been transparent. They have not shared that information. They have continued to claim privilege over that information despite our legal challenges. And I think that that's another thing people could address in their questions. Has the government provided a sufficient explanation about why this emergency legislation, which is extraordinary legislation, why it was invoked. We got to go to commercial break. But in the next segment, Russ, I want to talk to you about the background that people need to be aware of when sending in a public comment, because it's really important to recall some of the factual background about what was happening around the Freedom Convoy, as well as the legal background around this act, which, as I've said, is extraordinary legislation. We've got to go to break, but we will be right back. We're discussing the independent inquiry into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act in response to the 2022 Freedom Convoy, and the fact that this inquiry is now taking comments from the public. So that means that you, our viewers, can actually send in a comment to this independent inquiry about what your experience was like as a participant or observer or affected person related to the 2022 Freedom Convoy. Now, Russ, I think that it's so important to understand the background of what happened in early 2022 with the Freedom Convoy, as well as the history of the Emergencies Act. What can you tell us about this background? What do you think people need to keep in mind when sending in a public comment?
So it's important to remember that the Emergencies Act came in as a replacement of a previous emergency type of legislation called the War Measures Act, which is probably most famous for being used to intern Japanese Canadians in World War II. So there's a bit of a dark history there. And the Emergencies Act was specifically crafted in the post-charter era to hopefully be a less abusable act by government, something that would be used in true emergencies, that had these built-in aspects to the legislation that would keep a check and balance it for it, so that it wouldn't be abused in the future.
Yeah, and that legislation, the War Measures Act, was actually abused by the current Prime Minister's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And when the Emergencies Act, the replacement to the War Measures Act, was crafted, it was intended that it couldn't be abused again by setting out these really strict criteria that in this case wasn't met. So, Russ, that's why we at the CCF are challenging the federal government's use of this law. What more can you tell us about the law itself?
The biggest thing is that people need to remember that this act is meant as a last resort. It's not supposed to be a tool that the government, gets into for political convenience or just to make something go away. The threshold is very high. It was designed to make it difficult to use so that it would only be a last resort piece of legislation. And it even has this built-in feature where an inquiry has to be held after its use. So this Rouleau Commission, it's important to remember that this is not a voluntary decision. It's occurring because the act requires a commission to be set up after its use, so that it can be looked into to see if it was appropriately used or not.
Yeah, I frankly think that if it was not required by law, the Prime Minister would probably not have called this independent inquiry. And if I were a betting woman, I would bet he is not happy that it's taking place. Now, one of the other things I want people to remember about the Emergencies Act is that it actually it vests incredible power in the cabinet, including the power to create new criminal offenses and create new police powers, which they actually did in this case. They created these economic measures that allowed for the freezing and seizing of bank accounts, which violate normal principles of warrantless searches, unreasonable searches. It allowed banks to go in and freeze and seize assets that way. And that was all of these powers are without public debate, without recourse to Parliament, without advance notice. So really, truly, this Emergencies Act is an extraordinary law, and I think people need to remember that. I also want people to remember, the lack of transparency around the use of this law. The government is required to provide an explanation about why they invoked it. Russ, what can you tell us about the lack of transparency and the reason the federal government claims they invoked this? What do people sending in public comments need to know about that?
The biggest thing is that so far the government hasn't really provided an explanation, aside from a simple declaratory statement saying that it was an emergency, we needed to uh, invoke it, and there's not a lot of transparency there. It's kind of just like just trust us is the messaging that the CCF is kind of interpreting that as, and that's why we've got this concurrent challenge alongside our involvement in the as a standing member in the Rolo Commission too.
Now, this inquiry is separate from our legal challenge. We have brought a challenge seeking access to those documents. We have not received the documents, although as a result of the challenge, we did receive some documents from voluntary disclosure that would never have been seen without our challenge. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing the independent inquiry into the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act and the fact that this inquiry is now accepting comments from the public. So that means that you, the viewer, can send in your own comment about your experience, observations, or how the use of the Emergencies Act or the protests themselves affected you. So Russ, who works with me at the Canadian Constitution Foundation, when are these public comments being accepted, and how long do people have?
Well, hearings begin September 19th. So honestly, it's probably preferable to get them in before that, but they will still be accepted until October 31st.
Yeah, I mean, if the comments are going to be quoted, have the potential to be quoted in the hearings, that means ideally you would want to get them in before the hearings start. But the inquiry website also says that the public comments will not be quoted or mentioned in the report without express permission from the authors. So you do have that information that's important to have as well. Russ, how long should a letter to the inquiry be, and what advice do you have about the length in particular?
Sure. So as I said before, best to get straight to your main point. 1 to 2 pages is probably preferred because it's going to they're going to be getting a lot of comments, and the fastest you can get to your point and your reason for putting it, I think the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think any longer, your letter might not be read as carefully. Although these are experienced and respected lawyers who are staffing this commission, it's best to get to your point succinctly. One thing that a lot of people have asked me is, can you submit anonymously? Do you have to put your name on your letter?
It can be sent anonymously. It's probably beneficial too that if you were to do so, to make sure to explain why that might be the reason. You don't have to, but there's probably a reason you're doing that, whether it be fear of a repercussion from employer or other relationships. And that's one of those reasons why, or those are reasons why this providing this input is so important, because this Emergencies Act has created this situation in Canada where people are cautious to express themselves, I guess, over it.
Yeah, I mean, I personally think it's more impactful if you stand behind your words and put your name to them. But I also understand why people might want to send a submission in anonymously, especially because I know a lot of people did experience professional repercussions if they participated in the Freedom Convoy, and they might want to avoid having to go through that again. There was also a hack of information of donors to the convoy where people's names and addresses were released online, posted on a map for anyone to access. So I understand the concerns around why someone might want to submit anonymously. I think it makes sense to explain why you're making that choice, though. And ideally, if I were sending a letter in, or we are sending in a submission as an organization with standing in the inquiry, but if I were to personally send a letter, I would probably put my name behind it. I also think if you want to send a letter in anonymously, it's important to put where you live. I think it's important to say what country you're a resident of, because we all remember those allegations that the Freedom Convoy was, foreign funded, something that turned out not to be true. So to avoid allegations like that about people sending in public comments, I think it makes sense to say where you live. Russ, last question. How can people learn more about how to send in a public comment? Where can they get all of this guidance in one place?
So the easiest way would be just going to the ccf.ca. Right on our homepage is a link right at the top where it has all those potential questions, of course, the address, both the email and the mailing address, as well as the information about the dates of when things are due, as well as other suggestions about style and substance, so people can send it in.
Russ, thanks so much for joining today and for your work on this initiative. I think it's so important for people to send in the public comments, and the advice you've given today is excellent.
Thanks so much for having me.
Today, we've discussed the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act in response to the 2022 Freedom Convoy, something that we at the Canadian Constitution Foundation have argued was illegal and unconstitutional. We're challenging that law in court, but now is an opportunity to have your voice heard. Send in a public comment to the independent inquiry. These comments matter and will inform the inquiry of the full picture of what happened at that protest. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.